Here's a COVID riddle for you. Is it worth it to visit a museum in person, or can you see everything that's worth seeing online? It's not a real riddle because right now there is no choice. We're living life through our screens. But maybe you've gone to a virtual concert this year and had a pretty good time. Or maybe had a game night, gone on a date, took a cooking class. So maybe you'd say yes, it's totally worth it to participate in what we would call quote unquote normal life online. I'm back in my final year at McGill University in Montreal, where my favorite college professor, a guy named Peter Yunkin, poses this very question. Is it worth it to visit a museum? Let's say the Louvre in person. At the time, I just sit there, wondering, what are we talking about here? I mean, I'm from Paris. The Louvre is iconic. That's not a question for me. It's a fact. Every time someone visits us, we take them to the Louvre. But do I stick my hand up in the air to share that? No. Every student has an opinion. But most of us shuffle our belongings and stretch, eventually daring to look up to the front of the class where Peter stands thrusting his arms out as if to say, well, this question won't answer itself, will it? And as you all know, there's always that one kid who inevitably can't keep his thoughts to himself. And he says something like, it depends on what you're trying to get out of the experience. A classic non-answer that Peter doesn't even acknowledge. And we're off. Art is meant to be evocative. It's impossible to feel the full extent of its impact unless you're standing in its presence. 1 point for the Louvre. But what about VR? Someone else says. What if a virtual tour is so incredible that it's impossible to distinguish reality from virtual reality? Peter jumps in to say, for practical reasons, let's stick to technology that exists today. And with that, someone finally says what I've been thinking all along. Of course it's worth going to the Louvre in person. I mean, Da Vinci and Michelangelo, if the Louvre isn't worth visiting, I don't know what museum is. A junior raises her hand hesitantly and points out, it's expensive to fly to France. Riding on that momentum, someone blurts out, the Louvre is kind of overrated. Like, we've all seen the masterpieces before, and there are thousands of tourists. The whole experience is so commodified, it detracts from the art itself. And thankfully, someone interjects to defend the Louvre, leading to my classmates deciding it is, in fact, worth it. If I'd raised my hand early on, I could have saved us all the trouble. But I didn't share my opinion because I'd been focused on a different question altogether. Why are we indulging this exercise to begin with? Peter lets us squirm for a moment longer before smiling and saying, yes, of course you should go. The question actually has nothing to do with the Louvre or the paintings or any of it. He says it's all about immersing yourself in a different environment. It's the smell of the fresh bread wafting from a local bakery. It's the random conversation you strike up waiting in line, or stumbling across a painting you've never heard of. It's all about the little happy accidents that make up a new experience. Whether it's going to the Louvre or a beach or a hiking trail, Peter argues that doing something new is worth it because it shakes you out of your patterns. A novel experience is like a key that opens the door to a whole new perspective. Peter explains that this change in outlook is what inspires creative thinking. At last, I finally got why Peter posed this question about the Louvre. For an entrepreneur, it's just as important to pursue novelty as it is to have an elevator pitch and know your target audience. The gist is this. Break out of your routine and you'll find new creative energy. What I didn't realize back then is that only months after graduating, I'd meet two guys who had also been inspired to shake things up, because some other wise sage had pushed them to embark on daily adventures outside of their comfort zones. For Matt, it was Ben Nemtin, who formed a group called The Buried Life. Ben and his friends had a show on MTV about traveling cross-country, checking items off their bucket list. For Amar, it was Jason Silva, an Emmy-nominated host of the National Geographic award-winning show Brain Games. Jason is known for his long-winded but incredibly inspiring tangents on serendipity. These three inspirations, Peter Yunkin, The Buried Life, and Jason Silva, were all kind of saying the same thing, just in different ways. Essentially, they were telling us to just get out there, start living, put yourself in positions where life feels a bit unfamiliar. That, they argue, is where inspiration hits.